Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first sort of real class of Module 3. The session last week was more on just introducing what we're trying to do. It was sort of like this weird brainstorming discussion session. But ultimately, I think it was very productive. So this is going to be the first sort of real, I guess, lecture of Module 3. Um, and wait, sorry. Let me do this. Um, wait, sorry. Okay. Okay. So, uh, again, we haven't uploaded the recording for the last session yet on YouTube, but we will soon, and we'll upload this as well. So, okay, let's get started. I don't know if any of you know, I mean, I'm sure some of you do, where this quote is coming from. It's from Descartes, right? One of his texts where he goes, and he's famous for this statement, I think, therefore I am. We're gonna be kind of unpacking that. But before we go right into that, I want us to do a little bit of a brainstorming exercise. Uh, and we'll just get into it and it'll sort of it'll I guess what we'll be talking about today will reveal itself as we do this. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of a thought experiment. And I understand this might feel a little bit on the nose for some people, given funding cuts and everything going on in the academic space right now, but bear with me. So imagine you're you're trying to establish an educational institution, a school, and you only have a limited amount of funds. And I have six subject matters here. And really, given your limited funds, you can't establish departments for all six. And so you're going to have to choose four. And I want you all to sort of sit with this for 2 to 3 minutes. Or is that enough time? Maybe 5 minutes. Um, and then try to pick four. Pick four of these subjects that you want to prioritize, that you want to choose to teach in this institution of yours. And then also um, provide a little explanation on why that's the case. Similarly to last week, I have this Google Docs where we'll sort of brainstorm together and I'll write everything down. So, oh, sorry, the screen up there is not working. So I'm just teaching like this. You know what? Maybe okay, think about it. Let me relocate so people can watch. If I do it there, you guys can watch. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'll do that. So I'll repeat it to you guys. I already mentioned, I already tossed it to the group. Doing this little brainstorming activity where you imagine you're like establishing a school and we have these six fields, but we have limited funding, so you can only pick four. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, and you have to explain why. So I toss that to the group and we'll brainstorm together like last time. Okay. You can reconvene in 2 minutes, 10:42. Once everyone finished brainstorming. Yes, sorry. Let me make that. Let me switch back to that. Maybe another chat in case anyone's mentioning here. MBG. Um, maybe one day. And again, you can just, once you're ready, you can just uh, answer in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want to just explain directly. So 1 more minute. Okay. Okay, so we have a few answers here. I'm gonna do something annoying and I'm gonna ask you to explain. So everyone who answered, you have these four choices. Why did you pick them? And or maybe if you don't explain the four choices, explain why you left out the two that you left out. Does anyone wanna say something? So Frank, you're here. Maybe you can start. You picked four options here. Do you want to say why?
Yeah, so I think social science covers like humanity now, sort
Okay.
of. History covers humanity's past, so lessons we can learn from the past.
Okay.
Natural science covers the world now and the past.
Yeah.
So these are like things we need to understand ourselves.
Okay.
And at mathematics, it just betters, it's a tool. And I think human society has lived and been fine without computer science, it's fine.
Okay. We'll be fine without computers.
And we covered some aspects of literature and religion.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like it sucks to cut that out, but I think
Yes.
the lessons are embedded within social science and just good.
Okay. Okay. So in natural science, you were saying that this is something that, what were you saying?
Well, the history and social science is about humanity now and the past, but we also need to understand the world around us.
Okay. Yeah. So the non-human world.
Yes.
Okay. Natural science for the non-human world. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Oh yeah, Alicia, why did I bundle literature and religion? Aesthetic reasons, because I wanted six to fit in this grid. And so I just had to bundle these together. And also because I want to include religion, given that, we're talking about Indonesia. So it's um so there's an ex was there another explanation? Okay, let's see. You didn't pick computer science and literature and religion. Does anyone want to defend literature and religion? Okay, Gab and Noor, I see you have literature and religion. I hate to call people out, but do you wanna say why? I mean, Alicia, I think you pick lit and religion too. Yeah. Does anyone wanna comment on that? I see there's no love for computer science.
I'll start, and
Norm,
then maybe other people can
you
fill
can
in the
tap,
gap.
you can type a short answer, or I can unmute you if any of you want to.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Oh,
of
wait,
course.
Gab,
Okay,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Let me turn on the speaker. You can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you guys hear
Hello.
my voice?
Yes, I can hear you.
Actually, it's also like very personal experience. I grew up in religious institutions when I was in senior high school and junior high schools, and somehow I still think spiritualism still matter in my
Okay.
life.
Yeah.
So it's more like it's not religion as religious institutional approach. It's more like faith.
Mm.
So in my case, I still need to learn literature to know about people's dynamic. That's why I exclude social science, even if I graduated from social science major. And I don't know the definition of social science in the different civilizations. What is the spectrum of it and what is the limitation of it? That's why I
Right.
exclude social science. And I believe that literature and religion is also part of the social science discourse. That's why I put it together
Mm.
in religions.
Yeah.
Um, and many people's live with faith for many centuries, even if some didn't.
Yeah.
That's what make them survive, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I chose literature and religions. Well, it's not like Abrahamic religions. Some people's believe in goddess or mythology. like Egypt. So I think literature and religion is the core foundation for kid, even if they don't live it when they grow up. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's why I choose literature and religion. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Alicia, you raise your hand. You can just unmute and
Yes. Kedengeran nggak? Can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. Okay, I think I've talked about the religion part, so I'll talk about the literature part, and I guess why I excluded computer science. I think literature and art is what makes us human. I think from the age, like from the beginning of time, right? Like cave paintings, the fact that we invented language so that
Mm,
we could communicate shows that like literature, like sastra, is really like a key part of what makes humans human, what sets us apart from other species, but also like what allows us to express our emotion, what allows us to express dissent, especially in Indonesian contexts. Like a lot of poets and writers use that as a tool to criticize, um, criticize the government or colonialism. I think it's just the most important thing. And like what makes us human, really. And then the reason why I excluded computer science, I felt like math kind of covers that. Like math will eventually lead to computer science. And I think computer science is actually the one like we, before the internet, I guess, before technology, like we lived without it. And I think like just to get a little spicy, the reason that like there's a lot of slop out there, I think, is because schools don't focus on literature and the arts, and there's such a push for CS, even though CS is like obviously an important field today. Um, because we're losing like, what makes us human, what makes us express emotions, what makes us like
yeah.
complex thinkers, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me go through the chat, see if anyone said anything else.
Human, not woman.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why I wrote that.
You didn't know it. Thinking about women all the time.
What the? This is recorded.
Yes, you're right. Forgot about that.
Oh my God. Yes. Okay, so okay, thank you for all the answers. Let me just move forward because we have quite a bit of material to get through today. A few themes, if I trying to summarize everything that everyone's saying in terms of why you pick what you did. Critique is one thing Alicia mentioned, right? You want some fields are important because they sort of help us develop the critique. Frank is almost like the way you went about it was almost like you're trying to divide the domain of knowledge. There's human, there's non-human. And then Geb with religion, why is it important? Personal importance, right? Some things are just so personal and important to you. It's subjective, and that's why should that be a reason why something shouldn't be included in a curriculum and what matters to learn. Also relate some discussion on utilitarianism. Is computer science useful? Is religion useful? Does it help people survive? And then also, this comes up a lot. What makes us human, right? Like, again, it's related to the personal importance part. What makes us human? What matters to us? And the reason why I did this exercise is, and as it turns out, it's a lot of your answers kind of sort of tabulate with a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today, which is knowledge neutral? And we've seen here that it's not really, because given how things are in the world, in society, you kind of have to pick. You kind of have to do this exercise where you sort of start thinking about what kinds of knowledge do I want to prioritize? Why are certain sorts of knowledge more important than others, right? And then, given all of this, what does it mean to think of educating people? Why are you doing it? Why are you, and what exactly are you trying to develop or impart? This becomes a question that you kind of have to ask yourself. And where this becomes relevant for today is when we sort of juxtapose that with sort of sensibilities that often say that, well, we need to teach objective things. We need to teach facts. We need to develop reason. What does that mean? Because that sounds monolithic. It sounds objective. It sounds neutral. Is it really? that's the theme we'll be talking about, and that's sort of where I bring in the main character for today, which is Enlightenment reason. And so let's go a little bit into the subject material. Enlightenment reason. What is it? Where do we start? And it's just a screenshot of Wikipedia, and I don't know if you sort of how much this is taught in school, but there's often this notion of a scientific revolution that happened in the 17 and 8 and around the 16th and 17th centuries. And there was the sense that this, and again, this is Wikipedia is quite clear, is quite explicit here, right? It's a convenient boundary between ancient thought and modern science. Modern science, modern thought began with the scientific revolution. And there's a sense that after the scientific revolution, we became scientific. We became more objective. So let's unpack this a bit. What's going on here? And here there are a few key figures that are mentioned, and I will just go through them a bit and try to sort of unpack what this revolution is really about. And what does that have to do with sort of our earlier unpacking of reason and enlightening? So Francis Bacon, Englishman, 16th century figure. I won't go too much into who he was, but we're going to be talking a bit about one of his books, De Novum Organum, which means the new organum. And organum is a Latin for sort of an instrument. It was often used to refer to Aristotle's system of logic. And so that itself tells you something, right? He's trying to develop a new method, a new instrument. An instrument for what, though? And here's an excerpt from him. The unassisted hand and the understanding left to itself possess but little power. Don't think about a hand, think about the understanding, your mind. It doesn't have power on its own. How does the mind get to have power? By the means of instruments and helps, which the understanding requires no less than the hand. So what is Bacon's Novum Organum? It's a method. It's an instrument that you use to sort of develop your understanding, to give it power. So again, we're talking about education, right? And so in a way, you can think of this as a kind of sort of educational mission, right? This is an instrument by which, if you absorb this, you'll become a better thinker. That's sort of what he's saying, in a way. What is Bacon's instrument? So much of the Novum Organum is sort of this very dense and like sort of philosophically, it's responding to tradition, to this school called scholasticism, which is kind of like a synthesis of Christian thought and Aristotelianism. If anyone's interested, we can talk about that more later. But I don't want to sort of focus on that because that's just take us into too many tangents. I'm just going to focus into a few details about what sort of Bacon thought this instrument was. And here he says that there are two methods of discovering truth. Two instruments, maybe, if you might. The first one, you sort of start from your senses, you start from your perceptions, and then you move on to general axioms, general law. Like, for example, like you observe human behavior and you're like, oh, humans are, annoying or whatever. That's a general axiom. Yes, and this is the way now in use. So this is Bacon saying, this is the organum that is now in use. People just observe and then they draw these general axioms. And then he proposes a new one, which is that and essentially what Bacon is trying to say here is people tend to jump too quickly from these observations to these general laws. What he's trying to argue is basically, we shouldn't do that. We should spend more time on the observations. And I don't know if anyone here is sort of in the natural sciences, but this sounds a lot like empiricism, right? You have to observe sort of these phenomena very, 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 very carefully. Take them seriously. Don't jump to your conclusions. And that's exactly what he says here. The only way to advance sort of science in Bacon's estimation is you have to conduct a lot of experiments. So this is really, you kind of see the genesis in a way of like a very conscious attempt to like ground knowledge in experimentation and observation. This is not new. Aristotle did the same thing, but Bacon is going to foreground it even more. And really, it's the experiments part, I think, that makes Bacon especially distinct. And it's also interesting where the goal that he mentions for this, it's for the endowment of human life with new inventions and riches. Inventions and riches. Why should we bother with all of the science, with all of this new organon? Because if we discover these new things, they can make us rich. They can make our life better. And again, this is a bit of a shift. If you read a lot of the classical Greek texts, they're sort of kind of ambivalent on this, because a lot of them are quite aristocratic, and there's this sort of ideal that like we get to philosophize because we have free time, we don't have to do labor. And so for them, it's like pure thought becomes more important than actually like sort of almost I don't know, inventing a wheel or something like that.
Aristotle thought experiments were not necessary. Aristotle was like, you can figure stuff out just by mind, just by thinking about thought experiments.
And Aristotle was sort of like, he was kind of both. Because he's sort of like, Aristotle was, I think he's OCD. Because
Not you, Dai.
that's just me. But so much of what Aristotle did was just classifying stuff. There's this relentless drive to just put everything into like a Linnaeus chart. Right? Everything was like in this like sort of like catalog system. But he was I don't remember if he used the word experiment, but he was also very empirical in the sense that he was famous for like dissecting and sort of collecting a lot of specimens from the animal kingdom. The lagoon in sort of Athens, I think he was sort of. I mean, that's how he came up with that table. So Aristotle is kind of interesting. I think who you think is more in that way is more Plato, I guess. But sort of bit of a digression. So it's a very inductive method, right? You sort of, scientific principles are important, but you want to observe stuff very, meticulously, and then you sort of come to these conclusions. And he even gives examples of how to do it. He has like this table of where he tries to tabulate what counts as heat. So he starts with the question, what is heat? And the way he does it is by basically like collecting all observations of what counts as heat and what sort of like can we exclude from heat based on what we see. So that's the OCD. But if you want to be a scientist, natural or social, I guess you have to be OCD. So that's Francis Bacon, all right? And you sort of have this experimental observation heavy method. Another figure that's important in this story of the scientific revolution is Descartes. Descartes is an interesting guy. He sort of, so apparently a lot of his, I think it's the discourse on the method, a lot of the revelations he had there, he had when he was sort of, I think his own words were, I was sitting under an oven. I don't think it's like what you think of as an oven today, but more like a fireplace, where he's just like sitting there, like sort of, he's like sort of like cradling himself, and he had a lot of these realizations, and that turns out to be a pretty accurate description of everything he does. So I lied a bit. I know this class is about I think, therefore I am, and we are unpacking the thinking part, but this actually comes from the discourse on the method, which we'll be talking about more in the next session. Today we'll be focusing on another briefer text, the rules for the direction of the mind. But Descartes, just to say a bit more about him, his philosophy and his sort of like treatises on how to think and sort of what's the nature of knowledge, what's the nature of thinking. That's what we're going to be mostly focusing on. But Descartes was also majorly important for his geometry, where he integrated geometry, which previously was the shapes. Like literally, like if you read Euclid, he's just drawing shapes. Descartes is the guy who integrated that with algebra. So if you go to a class and you're like, describe the circle's perimeter in terms of an equation, that's him. That's him. So just a bit fun fact. So we've talked about Bacon, we've talked about his inductive approach. Descartes kind of starts from another direction. He's more deductive. So what you said just now about like, oh, it's just from the mind, that's kind of Descartes. And again, similar. There's this same goal of like, you want to form true and sound judgments. You want to reach at the truth, and you have to direct the mind somehow. Almost like you need an organon. Descartes is also proposing an organon. That's why eventually he has a discourse on the method. What is this method? Now, for Bacon, it's very inductive. For Descartes, you should only focus on the things, only to those objects of which our minds seem capable of having certain and indubitable cognition. Only those things that are so clear in your mind, that's so obvious. So I think, therefore, I am is one of them for him. He eventually, and we'll get to that next session, but for him, this was like one of the things that are so clear. You can't deny it at all. And the model here for him is actually mathematics. Well, what's an indubitable statement? Mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2. Well, if you ask some mathematicians, they'll say, no, not really, but I'm not a mathematician. So again, a method. We need a method. And here he elaborates it quite clearly. First, you concentrate your mind's eye. You concentrate when you think about these objects. And then first you reduce all of these complicated ideas in your head to the simplest propositions, like 1 + 1 = 2, or I think, therefore I am. And then from there, you slowly build it up, one by one, until you reach the full picture. That's it's very meditative. It's very contemplative. You just sit with your own thoughts and you're like, oh. And again, the model here is math, and I think that'll become more clear when we look at Newton. And Newton is pivotal here because I've been simplifying the story. I've been talking about Bacon, I've been talking about Descartes, but there's this, they sort of become like these figureheads for like a lot of broader currents in this period. And what Newton does is he synthesizes all of them. And he does this in his Principia Mathematica, which I think the full translation is something about the mathematical principles of nature. And that's telling you something, right? I'm talking about nature, but not just nature. I'm expounding the mathematical principles of nature. Almost like I've extracted certain and indubitable cognitions of nature, and now I'm expounding them to you. And so it's a massive book. And he does it exactly the way Descartes does it. He starts first with definitions. Again, things that are obvious. Let's set things on very clear grounds. Quantity of matter, what is that? Quantity of motion, what is that? He defines all of that. There's more, but I've just put 2 as an example. And then once he has the definitions in place, he moves into axioms, obvious general laws. And I don't know how many of you got hazed in introductory physics, but this is a callback to it. Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion. And then this is, I forgot. I wasn't very good at physics. So again, definitions, axioms. And then from there, he builds more and more complex things. Book 1, he starts talking about the motion of bodies. And here he starts, and again, this is the model here is pure math. Now that you have your axioms, you begin proving propositions. And then each proposition proves the next. Proposition 1 proves proposition 2. Proposition 2 proves proposition 3. And he uses this to explain physical phenomena. Right? So this is where we start seeing Bacon creeping in, right? You're observing the external world and you're combining it with sort of like Descartes sort of method, right? You're sort of slowly building it through these little tiny bits of cognition, but ultimately they're a description of the natural world, of the world outside of you. And so here he talks about centripetal forces. And then another example here, he talks about the motion of bodies in eccentric conic sections. This is important because what he's building up to is a model of the solar system, of how the planets revolve around the sun. And again, he's building on Copernicus, he's building on Kepler, he's building on Descartes. And so first he talks about the motion of bodies, and then he goes a bit more complicated with that. Initially he started out with orbits. Now he complicates the picture. What if there is friction? Like, for example, when you're moving through water, or maybe even if you're moving through air, and he tries to model that. Here he talks about fluid dynamics too, and the screenshots are just there to illustrate. I don't actually know what he's talking about. And then finally, now that he's built up all of these problems, and this is insane, he does this for like hundreds of pages to the point where he's at the end, he's like, okay, I know this is a lot. Some of you might not find this all very useful. Just read pages, and he gives like a summary, basically. So that's Descartes. I mean, that's Newton. And then that's what you have. You have a model of the solar system. And here, if you can, I think there are free PDFs if you online if you want to scroll through them. Here he gives sort of tabulations of all of these things that he's been building up to. Here he's talking about sort of the orbits of the periodic orbits of Jupiter's moons. And then here he's talking about the movements of comets, right? So again, we really see Bacon and Descartes together here. And that's why Newton is so important. I forgot who said it, but he said something along the lines of like, Newton was the guy who separated classical philosophy and science. Before Newton, philosophy and science were indistinguishable. After Newton, science became its own thing. And it would just diverge, because you need so much specialized expertise and knowledge to be able to do this, to know the math, to tabulate the observations. That's another thing that's interesting thing about sort of how knowledge becomes something that's specialized and becomes sort of an expert field. And so just to summarize why Newton is so important, Newton synthesizes all of this, right? The induction, the deduction, and this is really what I hope has been coming true is that through all these figures is that, and I think that's sort of what people usually think about when they talk about the scientific revolution is this method of helping the mind discover truths, use sort of Descartes' words. And these truths are almost mathematical, right? They're almost law-like. They're sort of like, they're there and you just have to think hard enough and do enough experiments, collect enough data, and you can get these laws. And that brings us to the Enlightenment. And we'll be talking about, Encyclopédie. It's a French, it's not the first encyclopedia, but it's sort of considered a seminal text in the Enlightenment. And again, the encyclopedia is not the only thing that does this, but it becomes the most clear symbol of the Enlightenment ambition, which is to take all of this and then to disseminate it to people. And so here is a brief outline of what the encyclopedia thinks itself of. It's, again, the work of a society of men of letters. So there's this sort of self-consciousness that we're a society of letters. We're learned people. And then, again, you want to set forth, as well as possible, the order and connection of the parts of human knowledge. You already see that with Newton, right? You can have a synthetic system that connects all parts of nature. All of nature is connected. We just have to figure it out. The encyclopedia operates on the same principle. And again, the general principles, right? You want to outline the general principles that forms the basis of each science and each art. The general principle, the sort of Cartesian law that you uncover through like thinking. And then to sort of link it more explicitly to what we've been talking about before, the encyclopedia and the Enlightenment more broadly has a sense of where it's sort of coming from. There's this historical understanding that where they stand now during the Enlightenment, that's the 18th century, Europe was moving out of a long interval of ignorance that had been preceded by centuries of enlightenment. So what was this enlightenment? It was the period of ancient Europe, of Greek and Roman civilization. And then Christianity came, and you had the Dark Ages, and then people were dumb. But now people are not dumb anymore. Why? Because now we have the Renaissance. The Greek Empire was destroyed. This was the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. And its ruin caused the small remainder of knowledge in the world to flow back into Europe. The invention of printing and the patronage of the Medici and of Francis I revitalized minds, and enlightenment was reborn everywhere. It's a very clear narrative. We were smart, we were dumb, we got some of the knowledge back, and now enlightenment is returning. And again, printing, that's also big, right? What is the encyclopedia? It's printed text. How do you disseminate this knowledge? To printing, to printed texts. And And here again, that's sort of to continue linking back Bacon, Newton, Descartes. The writers of the encyclopedia, and here the two main figures are Denis Diderot and D'Alembert. They were very conscious about this heritage. Again, Bacon, they mention here, like, again, same. There was an open war on philosophy and truth, but then there were these few great men, and then they sort of preserved all of this. Who were these great men who helped us illuminate the world? Francis Bacon, Descartes, Newton. So again, it's a very self-conscious story. It's a narrative. Well, I don't know if it's self-conscious, but it's very conscious. And so again, this just to really hammer the point home that this is really about what is enlightenment. It's about dissemination. It's about education, right? You have all these principles that the scientific revolution had enshrined, and now the Enlightenment is here to spread it to society. Again, to enlighten people. Again, this is another sort of, this is the end of the preliminary discourse where they're like, why are we doing this? Again, hopefully it will expound the true principles of things. It will note their relationships. It will contribute to the certitude and progress of human knowledge. And then all of this will contribute new advantages to society as a whole. They see this as a good thing. Like, this is unabashedly a good thing. Disseminate knowledge, enlighten society, and everyone will be better off. And this is a great book by Antoine Lilti on the Enlightenment. And he says that, when you look past all the different philosophical and scientific and theoretical differences of the figures in this period, what unites them is the militant desire to teach. They want to teach. They want to disseminate all of this. They want to enlighten. And here, the encyclopedia is an interesting text. So I think it's worthwhile to sort of spend some time looking at its contents. Here is an illustration at the beginning, and here is, like, again, enlightenment. It's that imagery of light, right? And that's what this picture is. I think this figure here, who's like glowing literally in the middle, is truth. And what's happening here, there are two figures here. I think that's philosophy and reason or something like that. They're unveiling truth. And when they unveil truth, the light of truth like shines out. It's a very clear message. Reason and philosophy and knowledge will cast off the darkness of ignorance, and the light of truth will shine out. And the German word for enlightenment of Klarung, again, there's a foundation of light, and it's even more clear in the French, lumière, literally light. It's like this, like, brighter dawn, almost messianic if you think about it, in some ways. And then here is an interesting sort of, again, we talked about how knowledge is this sort of ambition to create this, like, universal, like, comprehensive system of knowledge that explains everything. We have it here with the sort of this figure of human knowledge where they try to classify all kinds of knowledge into different sections. Here we have memory, reason, imagination, and then philosophy. And yes, I don't read French, so but yeah, so that's encyclopedia. And the way it's structured is that it's arranged alphabetically, and you have within each alphabet there's like entries on like all different topics, and the things that they choose as topics are quite interesting. Here is the encyclopedia being self-referential. There's an entry on the encyclopedia in the encyclopedia. Again, same thing, right? You want to disseminate collected knowledge, and we want to do this because our offspring, becoming better instructed, will at the same time become more virtuous and happy, and that we should not die without having rendered a service to the human race. Well, again, it's very, yeah. There's one here on humor, and there's one on God too. And the God one's I like the God one because it starts with God. Tertullian reports that when Thales was at the court of Croesus, the prince asked him for a clear and neat explanation, and then after several vague answers, the philosopher agreed that he had nothing satisfactory to say. It doesn't start with a definition, and it sort of refuses to end on a definition. And here are, I think, usually some of the most, before I forget, if you're interested again to look it up, UMichigan has a repository. I've attached a link down there. That's the translated version, so it's all in English. And here, if you go to UChicago's Artful Project, this is all in French, but they also include the plates and sort of all these beautiful illustrations of all of these systems of knowledge. Here we have the nervous system, I think. This is a rustic economy of, I think it's a hatchery. This is the one in the middle is an illustration of a hatchery sort of in a farm. And here, of course, is it's monkey. And then here are, yep, musical notes. This is, I think, this is sort of like I don't know, it's like a forge or something. And then here is like architectural plans. So again, it's quite broad. They try to cover everything. Again, if you click on this link, they have all of this, and you can just like look it up as you want to. So yeah, that's the encyclopedia. But here is my thing so far. Why are we spending so much time on the Enlightenment? Why are we spending so much time on Europe? This is why. This is where we start pivoting to sort of thinking about why it's sort of why we're trying to interrogate this. Because so far we've been talking about this ambition to sort of disseminate knowledge in a very straightforward way, right? We have all of this catalog, we have all of these things, and we just spread them across the world. But what are these things really? What is knowledge? What is this light? What is this? And what is this method that Descartes and Bacon and all these people have been talking about? Are they really neutral? Is it really that straightforward to just talk about them, think about them, and spread it to everyone? Is knowledge really neutral? And I think where the encyclopedia gets interesting here is that it also describes societies outside of Europe. Here you have a cotton plantation on the left. Here you have the Chinese script. And here on the right, this is not from the encyclopedia, this is from Thomas Raffles' History of Java. And here's the Javanese Aksara. What are you doing when you describe things like this? When you say, I'm simply cataloging, I'm simply analyzing, I'm simply describing, are you doing something to it? Might you be committing a kind of violence to the very thing you're describing? Is that what's happening? And that's where we turn to Edward Said. And this is where we start, we sort of turn the story on its head. And we sort of try to ask all of these questions about, is this neutral? Is knowledge neutral? What is it doing? What is it really doing? And a bit on Said himself. Said, he's Palestinian. He was born when it was still a British mandate, and he eventually joined Columbia's English Literature department. And his positionality is quite interesting. Said is Palestinian, but he was educated in very European institutions. And you'll see later on, his intellectual sort of heritage is very European. And that gives him, that puts him in an interesting position, where he's sort of not quite Palestinian, but also not quite, Western. And it's sort of this position that sort of influences what we'll be talking about for the rest of the day, which is Orientalism. It's this landmark text published in 1978. And sort of, I don't think Said called himself a post-colonial thinker. I don't think the word was coined yet at the time. I think, I might be wrong. But eventually, Said's text became sort of considered like sort of the holy, was sort of like a foundational text of post-colonial thought. And a lot of the themes that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks, with Spivak, with Chatterjee, Chakrabarty, you'll already see a lot of them in latent form in Orientalism. So this is a key document. And what is it about? It's on Orientalism. It's on the Orient. And again, for those who don't know, it's sort of, the Orient is sort of how the West refers to the East. And it talks about the Orient. So we talk about the East, we talk about the Orient as if it's a fact all the time. The East, the West. And Said goes, what if it's not? What if it's created? What if it's a construct? And what if the field that creates it, Orientalism, is itself also a construct? So that's what we'll be talking about today, because maybe then knowledge isn't so neutral. maybe there's something going on. Maybe we have to think about how it's produced, not just disseminate it, but who's producing it? What's going on when you're producing it? And then how do you get to choose what gets counted as knowledge? And we'll start with Napoleon and his invasion of Egypt. And that sort of picks up somewhat with the themes of the encyclopedia. And here is a picture of the savants, this group of, and Napoleon, this was a project of conquest. He was trying to conquer Egypt. But he didn't just bring an army. He brought an entire apparatus of study, of knowledge production. And the most sort of emblematic version of sort of embodiment of that are the savants, or these sort of intellectuals who sort of follow him and sort of try to catalog everything they see. They try to study Egypt. And Napoleon's idea was to build a sort of living archive for the expedition. And he establishes this Institut d'Egypte. And the goal is to render Egypt completely open, to make it totally accessible to European scrutiny. From being a land of obscurity, Egypt was to become a department of French learning. So, kind of sounds like the Enlightenment, right? But there's, I mean, Said's being very intentional, but there's a slightly nefarious undertone. It's not just enlightening the masses. It's not just reaching towards truth. It's rendering Egypt completely open, cracking the shell. For what? For European scrutiny. And here, and again, it's sort of the word that we use today is like, it's a fact-finding mission. We're just there to find the facts, right? And here are some examples of what finding the facts might look like. Here are the savants measuring the Sphinx. This is the Rosetta Stone, which Napoleon's savants uncovered when they were in Egypt. The Rosetta Stone was sort of this set of inscriptions, which was eventually used to, I think, reverse engineer the Egyptian hieroglyphic system. The French were shipping it back to Paris, and then we got interested by a British ship. And so now it's in the British Museum and not in the Louvre or something. And then there's another text here. And this is the text that we mentioned, the description of Egypt. And it's very much like the encyclopedia. It's this catalog of, again, it's the description of Egypt, the catalog of Egypt itself. And what I want us to think about really is like, what's really happening when we're doing this? What's happening when we look at an artifact, like a monumental piece of architecture like the Sphinx, and we go, how tall is it? What material is it made of? Which might be different from you just stand in awe, or you think it's an embodiment of a god or of a dead king which you worship, right? These are very different relationships to a Sphinx. And the same thing with the Rosetta Stone. What are you doing when you look and you go, put it in the museum, cart it away? You have to put it on display. People get to see it. People get to learn from it. And the same thing with texts. We're doing the same thing with texts. We're taking everything, we're collecting all this information, and we're putting it in a book, and we're saying, if you read this, you'll know everything there is to know about this part of the world. We're doing something here. Let's unpack that doing. Let's think about it a bit more carefully. And here we turn to Sylvester de Sacy, who Said labels as one of the earliest Orientalists. And the example I want to turn to is this thing called the Chrestomathia. The Chrestomathia is sort of like it's a text, it's a collection of literature, usually from a different language, for the purposes of like analysis. So it's like sort of like if you want to learn Arabic literature, you buy the Chrestomathia and you sort of read it. But what I want to call attention to is, what is this text? What actually happens when you compile a Chrestomathia? You rarely just take the piece of Arabic literature. You don't really read it on its own terms. What do? First, you translate it. Then you select excerpts. And then you take excerpts from other kinds of Arabic literature. And then you put them together. You order them, you group them, you turn them into a narrative almost, right? A collection. And then you add some commentary, you add some analysis, and then you package it in a single publication. So what are we doing when we're doing all of this? We're rearranging, we're restructuring things. You're not, when you're reading an anthology of Shakespeare, you're not just reading Shakespeare. You're reading Shakespeare in a book that has been arranged in a very conscious way. These are his tragic works. These are his comic works. And the same thing is happening here. Knowledge is it's a very active process. You're actively, there's a choice you're making to restructure things in certain ways. And what are the implications? And it's clear here. When you do this, the Orient eventually becomes less important than what the Orientalists made of it. The Arabic, sort of the Arabic poem, or maybe a Rumi poem, if you want to be more tangible, starts to recede into the background because you're not just reading Rumi, you're reading Rumi as arranged by a certain author with a certain intention. What he was really saying, Sassi defended the utility and interest of such things as Arabic poetry, but what he was really saying was that Arabic poetry had to be properly transformed by the Orientalists before it could begin to be appreciated. You won't understand Rumi if you just read him, but read my anthology. That makes him more understandable. That's more accessible, or maybe less mysterious. Again, the Orientalist is presenting the Orient. How? By fragments. Fragments that republish, explicate, annotate, and surrounded with still more fragments. Again, it's that restructuring, right? And really, because you say these things like, we're just analyzing, we're just elaborating, we're just studying, it sounds neutral. It sounds neutral. It sounds so benign. I am simply describing and teaching poetry, literature, but it's not. Because there is an intention behind it. There's an intention behind it. There's a restructuring going on. And that restructuring kind of becomes silent. It becomes invisible. People don't realize that it's going on because these terms are doing such heavy lifting. And then what this does is that, what the silence does is that the text then comes to embody a certain Oriental naturalness or typical inevitability. What does Said mean? When you read a Chrestomathy, you don't think that's a restructuring. You think it's a natural description of Arabic poetry. It's just Arabic poetry. It's not a restructuring of Arabic poetry. It's just Arabic poetry. It acquires almost the nature of fact. Something neutral, something benign. And this becomes more explicit when Said talks about Ernest Renan, who sort of like really institutionalized Orientalism in France. And Renan was a philologist, so he's a scholar of languages. And Said is quite nuanced about this, but I'm not going to go into much detail because another tangent. But let's read this passage in.
There's comments.
Well, I think I can read them, and then I can decide to.
Yeah, just said, is it also happening last week?
I'm not familiar with the sort of like literary history of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. And sort of how it I mean, the example that I'm more familiar with is Rumi, who sort of like, well, it's packaged, right? Rumi has been packaged for, Rumi is a very religious writer, but certain translations of Rumi completely obliterate that fact. He's just spiritual, he's not religious. So I wouldn't be surprised if something similar was going on with Harun al-Rashid, with the 1001 Nights. But let's turn to Renan. Let's read this passage together because I think it's very
revealing. And it
demonstrates
everything we've been talking
in a
about.
lot of detail. Both linguists and anatomists purport to be speaking about matters not directly observable or observable in nature. A skeleton and a detailed line drawing of a muscle, as much as paradigms constituted by the linguist out of a purely hypothetical proto-Semitic or proto-Indo-European. So a muscle, or like a Semitic
language.
They're not
really observable.
in
a blunt sense. I don't see any muscles.
I don't see any muscles right now, right? Bear with me. I see some skin, but I don't necessarily see some muscles. Same thing with the label Semitic language. You have Hebrew, you have Actually, this is embarrassing. I don't actually know what are the Semitic languages. Like, so all of them, the actual languages. But the category itself, Semitic, or like the muscle itself, doesn't exist. When does it exist? Only through the laboratory and the library. The muscle only becomes visible when you dissect an organism in a lab. Then the muscle becomes visible. Same thing with Semitic. Only when you take all these languages, you compile them in a library, in a book, then it becomes Semitic because you've done the restructuring, you've done the arrangement. The text of a linguistic or an anatomical work bears the same general relation to nature that the museum case exhibiting a specimen mammal or organ does. You cannot see or understand these things without the mediation of the lab or the library. What is given on the page and in the museum case is a truncated exaggeration whose purpose is to exhibit a relationship between the scientist and the object, not one between the object and nature. And that's the heart of it, really. When you're describing the Orient, when you're describing Arabic poetry, when you're describing Semitic languages, when you're describing the muscle, again, the word describing is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It makes it sound like this is an objective relation between the description and the object, nature, whatever I'm trying to describe. I'm just describing it. Straightforward. What gets hidden, what disappears, is the fact that someone is doing the describing, and that this description would not be possible even without sort of what the person is doing. It's a relationship between the lab and the object, the scientist and the object, the linguist and the object. And that the point isn't to say that that's bad or anything, but that relationship disappears. It disappears. It's cloaked in, again, description. It's such a neutral word. But it's not. And that brings us to, if you have to take anything from today, take this, which is Said's theory of representation. Given all this, what then is the Orient? What then is Orientalism? The Orient is a representation. You have this massive, massive part of the world with so many different societies, so many different people, and you overlay this single category, this single representation on top of it. Orient, the East, Arab, Semitic, Muslim, Islam. These are all just representations that you just slap on top of this, of like these really complex realities, right? And it affects a kind of flattening. And Said quotes sort of I think a British official talking about sort of surveying its colonies. And then in one single breath, he says, India, Syria, the Middle East, and he calls them all the Orient. These are very different societies. And just lump them all as the Orient, right? And then, but this raises interesting questions. Like, what is exactly happening in this flattening? How did these categories come about? And what does this, and usually when you posit the Orient, you also posit an Occident, the West, Europe. What's the opposite of the East, the West? And so what does the Orient have to do with the Occident? How does the Occident reveal itself in the Orient? What's its role here? Because again, we've been talking about how, like, when you're describing things, you're analyzing things, the person doing, it's important to think about who's doing it. Who's creating the Orient? That's the Occident. How does the Occident insert itself here? And then how do these representations become real? Right? How does the East go from, I am describing the East to like, oh, that's the East. Obviously the East is collectivist. Obviously the East is, I don't know, authoritarian or whatever. How do they become real in that sense, where they sort of acquire the power of facts? And here, a little excerpt again from Said, and there's an interesting statement below here, where again, it summarizes everything we talked about. The Persians is this play by, I think it's Aeschylus, who's a classical Greek playwright. So representation isn't necessarily just Orientalism, right? Or like, this was written way before the colonial period we're talking about, but sort of the same mechanism of representation are working here, right? The representation obscures the fact, again, it's highly artificial. It's a representation. And what a non-Oriental has made into a symbol for the whole Orient. But it's the last line that I think is most interesting. All this is governed by some version of the truism that if the Orient could represent itself, it would. The Orient, the East, the Arab, the Indian, the Indonesian cannot represent themselves. What does Said mean by this? We'll get to it. So first, let's try to unpack sort of the elephant in the room, which is the Occident, right? The person doing all of this representation. What's going on here? Said, again, how do you have such homogeneous and stable sort of descriptions and categories about these complex societies? It's because they reflect a kind of desire on the Occident's part to do certain things. This Orientalism makes sense at all. That Orientalism makes sense at all depends more on the West. Orientalism isn't about the Orient, it's about the West. It's about the Occident and what it's doing, what it reveals about itself. And what is it doing? So, for one, Orientalism serves the different changing needs of Europe. So first, Europe encounters sort of the Orient and sees it as this weird and exotic sort of land that they don't quite understand. And so in some sense, Orientalism is a way to just, it's a heuristic, sort of simplify all of this. But then it morphs again. As you sort of see the ambitions of enlightenment come in, it sort of becomes part of this fact-finding apparatus, like this collation of knowledge. And then this apparatus of collecting knowledge gets intertwined with imperialism, with colonialism. And eventually Orientalists start serving in colonial administrations. And the example here is that will probably make more sense to everyone here is Snokhru Gronje, right? Sort of the Dutch Orientalists who infiltrated Acehni society and tried to like unpack Islam to inform the Dutch colonial administration how to pacify the Acehnis who are in revolt, or not in revolt, in conflict, in war. What does this do to the Orient? It objectifies it, right? Because then, as a material for study, the Orient acquired all the marks of an inherent weakness. You're only there to be described. You're an object. You're just there to be looked at and to be elaborated on. And this cannot happen without the Orientalists. You need the Orientalists to exist in a way. And then finally, and this is the most interesting part, the Orient creates Europe itself. This process of othering, of like sort of what is not me. And the more you sort of realize what am I not? I am not, I'm not vegetarian, so I eat everything. You know, it's sort of like when you sort of define, or think of it this way. You can define what it means to be an Indonesian in terms of positive terms. I mean, I'm Indonesian because I speak Bahasa, blah, blah, blah. But you can also define in terms of negative terms. I'm Indonesian because I'm not XYZ. As a throwback to last class. Maybe I'm Indonesian because I'm not liberal. And that's where all this discourse comes in. And here's an interesting quote, because here, Said's talking about a lot of romantic writers, and they had this sort of like dream where Oriental, and here in this case was Indian culture and religion could defeat the materialism and mechanism and republicanism of Occidental culture. So these are Europeans saying we should learn from, we should absorb the Orient. And the context here was that this is sort of the 19th century. There's sort of like this after the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution was gaining steam, and there's this sense that we become so materialist, we become so mechanistic. Life has become so rationalist, so dispassionate, so bourgeois. We need some vitality back. Where do we get that? From the mysticism of the Orient. Again, the Orient is creating Europe. And here they sort of, it's more of a fetishized sort of view, but you can turn it on its head again, because this exists in the reverse. Here it's like, we need Asia to renew us, but it can also be, why is Asia so backwards? Why are they so irrational? And that's sort of the version that is more familiar with the general colonial imperial narratives. But the Occident matters. It's again, it's like the word describing and analysis is doing a lot of work to obscure. And this is one of the things that's being obscured, which is the Occident's own role in creating the Orient. Here's let me see if I'm okay, stuff time. This is one of the travel sort of writers that Said talks about, Chateaubriand. Here he's talking about his sort of adventures in Judea. And it's very journalistic, right? It's very autobiographical. I mean, I think Said even uses the word voyeuristic sometimes to describe things like this. And one travels in Judea. At first, a great ennui grips the heart. But when passing from one solitary place to another, space stretch out before you. Slowly, the ennui dissipates, and one feels a secret terror. It gives me courage. He's not talking about Judea. He's talking about himself, right? This is a very extreme version of this, right? Except I don't know how much Chateaubriand. Chateaubriand here is not as explicit that I'm trying to describe Europe. I'm trying to describe the Orient. His ambition to do that is not as like explicit as Renan and everything, but it's still the same mechanism of when you sort of describe a place, it's like you insert so much of yourself into it. But don't we all do that? Does it you might, I don't know if you are in that corner of the internet, but you can find stuff like this in Substack. Find stuff like this in Tumblr. And I don't know if any of you writes fanfics, but isn't that what a fanfic is? You're sort of inserting yourself into a story. Oh, Napa is disagreeing. We can talk about that later. Aren't we doing the same thing? Don't we all do this? Are we all Orientalists? Said has an answer to that. And again, I'm also doing this, just as a disclaimer. That's what deconstructing is. I'm taking Bacon, I'm taking Descartes, I'm taking Newton, I'm taking Said, and I'm literally restructuring them. What Said was talking about, Sassi and Renan, they take fragments, they sort of arrange them with other fragments, they put commentary. I'm doing that. I've been doing that for the past 1 year. Am I an Orientalist? Am I doing the same thing? And Said's very clear on this, right? It's normal. It's perfectly natural for societies to look at foreign cultures, to see things that they don't understand, and to sort of make it slightly more like their own. So it becomes less unfamiliar. And Said's theory of representation is actually quite radical, because he claims that, can there be a true representation of anything at all? Really? Right? And all representations, because they're representations, are then they're subjective, because they're embedded in language and culture, and they're embedded in the subjectivity of the representer, the person who's doing the representation. So are we all just closeted Orientalists? I would venture to say no, because what makes Orientalism different is the power asymmetry. The Orientalist speaks of the Orient never gets to speak back. That's what makes Orientalism different. That's what makes all of these totalizing systems of representation different. The represented never gets to speak back. It's passive, it's supine. It exists merely as a vessel for the representer to impose everything it wants onto it. And here, when we talk about this power asymmetry, one of its dimensions, and that sort of naturally ties into module 3 and the Enlightenment, is knowledge. An asymmetry of power exists within knowledge as well, because Orientalism is also an academic tradition. And here we're going to turn to sort of how the Orient and how Orientalism was created as a process of knowledge production. And this becomes important because does the Orient get involved at all? Right? I mean, that's really one dimension of, I mean, there are other dimensions, of course, the asymmetry in politics, military power, and culture, but even in just knowledge production, that power asymmetry becomes very, very sharp. And so so before we get into that, let's try to think more about how knowledge acquires power, because this is, again, when we talked about the encyclopedia, it's sort of like dissemination. Let's unpack dissemination. What does that mean? How does knowledge get disseminated, and then how does knowledge acquire power? How does something become fact? How does something become truth? And this is part of what Said is getting at here. And here he talks about how, as a system of knowledge, Orientalism is less a place than a set of references, a congeries of characteristics that seems to have its origin in quotation or a fragment of a text or a citation from someone's work on the Orient. And again, references, citation. The academics here. H-index, who gets cited the most. This is how it happens, right? There's a logic. This thing has its own inner logic of who gets referenced, who gets cited, and then the knowledge builds up again and again and again and again. Is Plato influential because he's really that big, or because everyone just talks about him? Everyone just refers to him, right? It's a tricky question. And as a system of knowledge inhabits a common field of play defined by a common history, tradition, a universe of discourse, right? And then that's why sometimes when you look at academics in a room, the social scientists don't know how to talk to the humanities people because they all have their own common fields of play, right? Their own common tradition, their own history, their own universe of discourse, right? And this is where it gets very pertinent for us. Like sometimes someone might be telling something to you, but if you don't have a reference for where they're coming from, if you can't cite them, you really don't get them, right? It's like you walk into a room and someone is like, oh yeah, but Plato said this and Aristotle said this, and you're like, I don't know what I'm talking about. And you go into another room and they're like, well, here's Darwin, and if you've never known who Darwin was and who Darwin was responding to, how do you even insert yourself in that conversation, right? Or you go to board game night and you see a bunch of people nerding out about sort of Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and trying to talk about and if you just don't have that system of references, you'll just be completely lost. Like, what even are you talking about? This is what Said is getting at, a system of references. And this is important because no single scholar, no single scholar can go about this if they want to be influential, if they want their works and their thought to last. And he's quite explicit about this here, right? We will see in a sense how a very human being had and was able to acquire more of a productive capacity than an institutional dimension to it. When you're producing knowledge, you're not just producing knowledge as an individual. There's also this negotiation where you're sort of like, how do I produce my knowledge also as a part of an institution so that people actually read it, people actually understand it, people actually talk about it. I'm doing the same thing too whenever I'm presenting, right? I'm not just quoting Said. I'm also sort of like, okay, how do I package this in such a way that people who might have never read any post-colonial text might understand Said? I'm doing the same thing. But here the reference is less formal. The reference is sort of like, I don't know, maybe pop culture, maybe sort of, I don't know, what's like basic human experience that I think you might all have. I'm doing the same thing. And this surely is what the finite human being must aspire to if he is not to be content with his merely mortal presence in time and space. If you want to last, if you want your works to last, if you sort of want what you're saying to get into people's heads, and for that to get disseminated over time and space, this is sort of what you have to do. And this is how knowledge becomes a kind of power in its own self. And so we're gonna spend the next few minutes talking about exploring a few excerpts from a text by William Lane, who's a British Orientalist, because I think it's quite revealing of a lot of these dynamics we've been talking about. And so Lane, so again, it's a description of Egypt, right? Again. But what's interesting is his method. It's almost ethnographical. He has 2 periods of residences in Egypt. So he sort of lives with the Egyptians, I guess. He spends a lot of time with them, and then he claims to be observing from the inside, right? And here again, is key. One uses the phrase self-conscious because the impression Lane wished to give was that his study was a work of immediate and direct, again, unadorned and neutral description. Same thing we've been talking about, right? I'm observing them. I'm living with them. So this is all just descriptive. This is all very objective. But again, it was a product of considerable editing. Lane was able to submerge himself amongst the natives to live as they did, to conform to their habits. And this next section is very telling, especially when we think about power asymmetries. Again, Lane gets to do this. Why? Egypt was a British subject. Lane is British. He gets to visit there and observe and see whatever he wants. Does the Egyptian get to do the same? And the answer is no. Thus, while one portion of Lane's identity floats easily in the unsuspecting Muslim sea, a submerged part retains its secret European power to comment on, acquire, possess everything about it. Just lurking there, just lurking there. The Orientalist can imitate the Orient without the opposite being true. Lane gets to go to Egypt and go native, and the Egyptian doesn't really get to do the same. Until, of course, the early 20th century. And that's sort of where you sort of get a lot of these nationalist movements and anti-colonial movements. It's an important part of the story too. What he says about the Orient is therefore to be understood as a description obtained in a one-way exchange. They spoke and behaved, he observed and he wrote down. And again, it's not for the Egyptians. It's for Europe. The Lane's audience is Europe. The system of references. Who does Lane have in mind? Not the Egyptians. It's Europe. And what Europe thinks is useful knowledge. Another episode here describing Lane's principal informant, Sheikh Ahmed, which Said describes as both companion and curiosity. So Lane travels with Sheikh Ahmed throughout the text here. And it's kind of bizarre, some of the things that happen. The two pretend that Lane is a Muslim. And he sort of like, Lane sort of like goes to a mosque, pretends that he can pray, and then Sheikh Ahmed is like, initially scared, and he's like, oh, okay, you know what? You're very convincing. I'll go with you. And we had the traumatic father reference, yes, last week, and now we have role play. I don't know if we want to keep going there. And again, Said calls him out on this, right? This is very bad faith, right? It's again, you're sort of this privileged European. You're coming here and you're sort of like, oh, let me be one of you guys. And really, it's sort of no Lane again. Sheikh Ahmed is a curiosity. He's there and he's like, okay, I'm learning from him. See, I'm very locally attuned, but you never really treat Sheikh Ahmed as an equal. But a curio, sort of like, oh, he's telling me this. He's telling me this. Oh, you know, he's like, I prayed, and he was like, oh, you, what a good performance. I'll follow you. And again, all of that is obscured by what? By what? That the report seems accurate, general, and dispassionate. That Lane's text cancels, and this is where Said gets more political and more personal with this. The text cancels the human content of its subject matter in favor of its scientific validity. How does an objective description of something humanize something? This is the objectification we're talking about. And Said knows a lot about this because he's Palestinian. And finally, this is sort of, again, this is such a great just line, such a great description of like what Lane is doing, what, like, you know, this encyclopedic, this cataloging impulse does, right? It prevents narrative order. Egypt's own history, Egypt's own sense of narrative is completely destroyed. It's gone. It's missing from the text. Why? Because it keeps getting interrupted by like detail. Oh, they were praying. Oh, they were visiting the market. Oh, they practiced XYZ. Oh, they were eating this. It's just facts. And all sense of narrative disappears. And that's what Said does here, right? What Said says here, because the Egyptians are disemboweled for exposition and then put together admonishingly by Lane. Now, I think that's such a that encapsulates everything, right? You're disemboweling them and putting them together. That's what you're doing. And this is only possible, again, because Lane gets to disengage from Egyptian Oriental life. That's the power asymmetry. Because Lane is a British man coming into a place that's subjugated by sort of the polity that he's from. He gets to visit without actually having to engage with them. He can remain detached even as you're visiting. That's the power relation. You get to visit while remaining detached. You can go to Bali without ever really talking to a Balinese. It's the same thing. It's the same thing, right? And again, what's so important about this? This is how he gains scholarly credibility. This is, again, Lane does all of this, and it's presented as he's being objective, he's being factual, he's being dispassionate, he's being cold. Seen as a good thing. But again, that's just imposes a certain scholarly will on a reality that's actually quite untidy. And that's really the heart of what Said is so concerned about. What he thinks is the horror and the danger of Orientalism is that it just imposes, it dehumanizes all the human complexity, all the human messiness. All that's gone because of description. And then eventually Orientalism gets institutionalized. So when we talk about people like Renan, Sassi, Lane, right? Yes, a lot of them started out as just individuals, not as part of like a discipline. Like, I'm coming here as a sociologist, I'm coming here as an economist. They were mostly still operating as individuals. All of this gets institutionalized, and you can see that in Lane's own life. In his early works, he's an individual. Like in his sort of like account and manners, everything that we've been going through, Lane was still very much like, oh, I met Sheikh Ahmed, and this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm doing. This is what I see. In his later texts, the I completely disappears. Lane is no longer a narrator. He's just an annotator or a retranslator or a lexicographer. It becomes more and more impersonal. So again, oh, sorry. So the narrator disappears. Again, that's sort of what we've been getting at since Renan, right? Someone is narrating, someone is editing, someone is restructuring, but that someone disappears because he or she gets dissolved into impersonality, into sort of just dispassionate analysis, description. And it gets institutionalized because and then at some point, all the universities start establishing Orientalist departments. And so to be an Orientalist meant university training in Oriental studies. It meant subvention for one's travel. So now you have to apply for grants if you want to travel. And then you have to get published in an actual journal in accredited form. And it was all of this paraphernalia of institutionalism that sort of gives you the label scientific. If you're published in a journal, if you graduated from Columbia or Harvard, if you get your grants from the Royal Asiatic Society, that's what makes your work scientific. So we see the process of how this gets institutionalized more and more and more and more. And eventually this hardens, right? We've been talking about how this entire process dissolves the human complexity of the things you're describing into these very rigid categories, right? The East, the Orient, Islam, Arab. And Said traces this process, right? Where, again, Orientalism started with philology, with Ernest Renan, with language. And Renan was like distinguishing all of these languages, Semitic groups, and all the other language groups. And then eventually, once you realize that languages were distinct from each other, maybe the users of them were also distinct, right? Their minds, cultures, potentials, and even bodies, they were distinct. And these distinctions had the force of ontological empirical truth, again, because you're doing scientific. And so different language groups hardened into what? The Egyptians, the Muslims, the Orientals. And again, this is what Said critiques the most harshly about Orientalism. This is what Orientalism does to the Orient. It dehumanizes them. It turns them into these static, ageless categories. And it becomes very essentialist, right? Because the Egyptians become something that's sort of becomes almost like a laundry list of things. The Egyptians are X, Y, Z, A, B, and then that never changes. It becomes timeless, becomes trapped in amber, becomes frozen. And only the scholar, and this is where Said gets critical of sort of academic and intellectual culture too. Only because the scholar becomes a key member in manipulating and defining and creating these categories. And the scholar is compromised when the scholar pretends he's not doing something intentional, when he pretends that he's being neutral, when he renders, to use Spivak's word, when he renders himself invisible. The scholar isn't invisible. The scholar is actively involved in this. And then Said sort of distinguishes between two different ways of understanding the Orient and sort of describing or like sort of engaging with these societies even. And the first he calls vision, which is everything we've been talking about, this encyclopedic view that sort of wants to reduce everything into these static categories. And you might think, doesn't this sound like the encyclopedia? Doesn't this sound like Descartes? Doesn't this sound like Bacon? This sort of panopticonic sort of outcome might not be what they have intended, but you might say, reasonably so, that's what happened. That they had that there's that system of thinking, that way of looking at the world, of just cataloging, encyclopediaing from a distance, is something that creates things like Orientalism. And Said distinguishes it with another approach that he calls narrative, which is dynamic and historical. When we say things like the Egyptian, you freeze them in time. It's not the Egyptian that actually matters, the category that matters. The Egyptian. But that's not life at all. People are born, people grow, people change, people die, societies do. There's history moving through all of this. And so Said, and this is where I think Said sort of reveals his own position very clearly, that he's on the side of narrative. Said is arguing that, this idea of knowledge is just cataloging and it dehumanizes people. We should move to something that's a bit more narrative, that allows and counts for humanistic dynamism and vitality more clearly. This is not objective in the way that it prefers itself to be objective. That's Said's argument. And so we're coming to an end soon. But what does this have to do with the So I think this is a nice place to go back to the Enlightenment, because here it seems almost like, screw Descartes. Screw the encyclopedia. Like, why do this? That seems to be Said. And that seems to be Said's position too. But then things get interesting when you actually look at Said's own intellectual influences. They're all Europeans. And not only are they all Europeans, they're also all Enlightenment figures. Giambattista Vico, Herder, Wood, Gadamer, these are, especially maybe until Goethe and Humboldt, maybe. I don't know about Gadamer, but these are all figures that come from an Enlightenment tradition. And that's the interesting thing about Said. Again, he was nourished on the Western canon, on Western systems of knowledge and Western thought, right? And that explains a lot of this. But it also begs the question, have we been oversimplifying the Enlightenment? Right? These are Enlightenment figures, and they are very different from what we've been talking about. In fact, maybe Descartes is also kind of different. That's what we're going to next week. We're going to reread Descartes. We're going to see that Descartes too isn't as simple as we thought he was. So we're seeing in real time how, have we Orientalized the Enlightenment too? Have we created a representation of the Enlightenment? Have we done the same, right? And food for thought once we get to Q&A. What are other Orientalisms that exist in the world? Is gender an Orientalism? Is male and female? Is that an Orientalism? Is the economy an Orientalism? Is Indonesia an Orientalism? Is America an Orientalism? Is China an Orientalism? Interesting things to think about. And Lilti, again, to come back to him, has a more nuanced view of the Enlightenment, where again, it's not this method, it's not this, or not any specific way of thinking, not any ideology that makes the Enlightenment, but that what unites all these figures was a desire to impart to the public the tools for thinking critically. So maybe we have been oversimplified. Maybe there's more to the Enlightenment than we thought. And Said's own position is interesting because Orientalism is a book fundamentally about how certain European ways of thinking become a kind of epistemic violence. But how does Said himself think his way out to European thought? And so that doubleness is a theme that we'll also be coming back to again and again and again, because that sort of also lies at the heart of sort of Indonesia and its sort of emergence, right? This sort of doubleness, this sort of like critiquing, but you're also appropriating things from Europe, from the West. And Said is doing the same thing. And again, he himself is the best diagnosis for this. A system of references. What system of references do you have, right? And if you're in Indonesia that has been imprinted by Dutch rule for centuries, what system of references do you have? Some of them must be inevitably Dutch, European. That's it. That's a sort of like the weird tension that we want to unpack here. So that's it for today. Next week, we'll be returning to the Enlightenment. We'll be returning to Descartes, and we'll try to show a different side of it, a different face of it. Today, we've been focused on how Enlightenment is sort of, it's sort of this idealistic dream of knowledge, but it's also an idealism that can curdle and reduce itself to a kind of violent essentialism, as we saw with Said. Next week, we see a different side of it, a side of it that's much more emancipatory. It's much more subjective. It's much more skeptical. It's much more critical. And then we try to show how even that can still be problematic. And we're doing that by comparing two feminist thinkers, Mary Wollstonecraft and Gayatri Spivak. So that's it for today. Sorry if I rambled on for too long. Thank you. Maybe I will open everything up to discussion right now. O'Brien?
Read it out. If you want me.
I can read it out. Okay. So let me. We don't, unless someone wants to ask something spicy. I will let you all decide what spicy means. Okay. Okay, let me just read Brian's immediately. This was great, Derek. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think we can draw parallels between the institutionalization of C19 Orientalism through the you mentioned bodies, Royal Asiatic Society, etc., and say the Cold War era, mostly North American projects of knowledge production about the global South for the purpose of anti-communism. Projects, of course, which led directly to the institutionalization of modern area studies, where they similarly classificatory and or representative schemes at heart. Yes, and both. I don't think classificatory and representative schemas are necessarily intention. Representative systems can be fundamentally classificatory, right? For example, like Islam, Christianity, Arab, Chinese, Indian, or as the British would say, Hindu with two O's instead of a U. And so definitely. And yes, this is Said himself. I didn't have time to cover it, but Said himself eventually turns to American Orientalism too. And it's exactly like you, and for him, the primary difference is that whereas classical European Orientalism was founded on philology, so it's very linguistic sort of roots, American Orientalism was rooted in the social sciences. And it's intimately linked to the area studies project. And that's where the Cold War comes in too. A really big sort of, and you, if you read some of the foundational texts in area studies, especially in Indonesian studies, which is what I'm most familiar with in this sort of domain, like Kahin, George Kahin, or Herbert Fief. This actually comes through very strongly, which is modernization theory. And the context is this is 1940s, 50s. Yeah, it's Cold War. And really, the Americans found themselves in a position where they had to respond to Marxist notions of development. With Marxism, or at least a certain political strand of it, can be quite teleological, where it's sort of like you have feudal society, and feudalism results in capitalism, and then capitalism must inevitably collapse and like emerge as socialism, and eventually you have the communist utopia. And so that's very teleological, and in the sense that like that's where everyone's going, and that's sort of like desirable. We want to all go there, and that's development. That's kind of a vision of development in a way. And the Americans really needed to respond to that, and they came up with modernization theory, which is essentially an American version of development. And it's sort of rooted in these ideas where like you have all these different nations and peoples, and there's this like linear path too, but instead of feudal, capitalist, communist, it's traditional to modern. And what makes a society modern? Economic growth, industrialization, democracy, liberal values. And that sort of becomes the American template for the Cold War. And this gets fused with area studies because a lot of the early area studies people, a lot of what you will sense in their works is sort of that a feeling that they're applying modernization theory to describe all these different things. So when you read Kahin talking about the Indonesian Revolution, it's sort of, and the last pages are so illustrative of this. He goes, okay, what's been done, what hasn't been done? And it reads like a World Bank report. It's, okay, advances have been made in education and the literacy rate. And then some progress needs to be made in sort of freedom of speech and da. In terms of economic growth, it reads like a World Bank report. And you can sense modernization theory like speaking through Kahin and sort of Herbert Fief and all the other scholars of this generation. So yes, it is definitely, and Said talks a lot too about how even though American Orientalism has its origins in the social sciences, a lot of the cultural sort of baggage and sort of expectations that it has about looking at the Orient and sort of like treating it as this supine thing for it to be described, that also has a lot of roots in Europe. I think some of like a lot of European Orientalists eventually also got positions in American universities. So I hope that answered your question. Yes. Glad you enjoyed it. Okay, anyone else want to talk more about other Orientalisms? How other things we might be living today might be Orientalisms? Yes, Auf. Wait, yes, you can just speak up.
Hi,
Hi.
wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so yeah. First of all, that's really wonderful class from you. And I'm wondering about yeah, actually I want to ask about Orientalism too.
Mhm.
Probably back when Said released his book, there's some kind of phenomenon in Middle East where a lot of authoritarian and yeah and dictators feel legitimized by the way Said um yeah, they feel Said defend their own action as if it's not irrational,
Yeah.
and also and it makes in Middle East um like there's new phenomenon or a discourse that criticize the way Said um emphasizing representation in his theory, which is reverse Orientalism or Orientalism in reverse.
Mm.
And it's
Mm.
actually shows how people in the East also have their own Orientalistic view, where they saw East as Orient and the Occident is the West. So yeah, I'm just wondering, what do you think about this? Because I just dive deep into this topic recently, and you know I kept thinking about this, like
Yeah.
if this is the case, um how can we learn about other cultures?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably that's the question. I don't know how to like structure it, but I hope it's pretty clear.
Yeah. No,
So
thank
yeah,
you.
thank you.
No. Thank you so much. I'm glad you asked that question. In part because it was something that kind of I think it got to Said too. And I think in like I think the foreword of one of the editions of Orient, he actually addresses this directly. And he says something along the lines of, yes, of course, Orientalism is a critique of Western power, it's a critique of Western knowledge. And that's one part of representation of what it's talking about, which is that you have a representation that's imposed on something that has its own life, and then that representation smothers that life. And what Said is talking about here, obviously, is post-colonial societies, right? Where it's sort of Arab civilization was smothered by European civilization. And you can sort of replace Arab with any kind of post-colonial civilization. And Said acknowledges that he's like, I'm not going to take that away. These are societies which who have felt degraded for centuries, and now they find a text that they feel like finally speaks for them. Of course, they're going to reach for it. But that's not the other part. That's not the only thing about representation. And Said is talking about this in the context of Islamic fundamentalism, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he goes, but I'm also not advocating for a kind of essentialist revivalism within the post-colonial world. And again, we have to remember that Said thinks that while he posits theory of representations, he also says that there's no true representation. There is no true representation. So sort of the West's representation of the Orient smothers something. But the thing that it's smothering might itself also just be another representation, right? The Orient is obviously an orientalization, it's obviously a representation of the Orient. And maybe you'll say, okay, now that it's gone, Arab civilization can emerge. Well, maybe that's an Orientalism too. And that sort of gets to what I think you were saying, right? About the self-orientalization part. And so I think, and Said himself goes back to this. And I think that's why he sort of is very at pains to draw a distinction between vision and narrative. He fundamentally sees Orientalism as a broader project in anti-essentialism. Even if the post-colonial world is doing it, essentialism is still a kind of essentialism. And that's why I sort of like try to obliquely sort of throw the question out there of like, what if Indonesia itself is also an Orientalism? What if Syria is also an Orientalism? We are very liable to do this to ourselves. And I think Said also mentions in other texts about how, and this is, I think, gets your self-orientalization part, about how a lot of intellectuals in the post-colonial world, they have sort of unconsciously absorbed a lot of these essentialist ways of thinking, right? And sort of to link it back, for example, to Brian's question on the social science, on sort of area studies. Maybe you're trained as an American economist or sociologist and anthropologist, and then you inherit these sort of ways of looking and classifying the world in terms of like cultures and civilizations. And then you go back and then you apply that framework. And you might think you're doing it in an anti-Orientalist way, right? You're pushing back against Orientalism to sort of like pull out Indonesian civilization or whatever. But sort of in sort of holding on very strongly and hard to that essential concept of Indonesian civilization, maybe you're already replicating Orientalist like ways of thinking. So that's sort of my sense of like Said's own response to the dilemma you raised. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's answer my question perfectly. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Anyone else? Okay, no pressure. No? Oh. Yes, Indonesian civilization. So, you know what? On that note, let's end on that food for thought. Indonesian civilization, we can just on it. But thank you everyone for showing up today. And especially for people here. Wait, you're both not students. Never mind. It's because final season. But no, thank you everyone. I think that's all for today. I'll see you all probably next week. Okay, bye.